The world of work is changing, but you already knew that. The question isn't, is it changing, but what is it changing to? And how can we adapt, adjust, and thrive in that changing world? If you have thought about this, you're in the right place. Or now that I've asked, if you're thinking about it and saying, you're also in the right place. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I am so glad that you're here. If you're listening to this podcast, you could be live for future episodes on your favorite social channel. You can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to get all of the scoop. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each masterclass is designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or get discounts in the future can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, what I want to do is hit the magic button and bring in my guest. There he is. I'll get rid of this over the top, and you can see that I have with me Mr. Brian Elliott. Let me introduce Brian to you, and then we will dive in. Brian Elliott is a executive leader of Future Forum. We'll talk about that in a second. He spent 3 decades leading teams and building companies as a startup CEO, as a product leader at Google, and now at Slack, where he is a senior VP. Brian started his career at the Boston Consulting Group and earned his MBA from the Harvard Business School. His work has been published in the Harvard Business Review, Fortune, and The Economist. He is the proud father of 2 young men. He's the co-author of, he's got it over his shoulder, and I have it in my hands, How the Future Works, Leading Flexible Teams to Do the Best Work of Their Lives, with Sheila I got it. You're going to do it for me, Brian. I practiced and I still messed it up.
Sheila Subramanian.
Subramanian and Helen Cupp. Sheila, I apologize in advance. Brian, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Kevin, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you this morning.
And let's see, we got people from Iowa and India, and another person from San Francisco.
We're hitting the range. Yeah,
you're hitting the range, myself, and we've got Sri Lanka and more, right? And Indonesia. So we got all the I's. We got Indonesia, India, and Iowa. So listen, we are so glad to have all of you here.
And you're in Indianapolis yourself, right?
And that's right. And I'm in Indianapolis. So Brian, let's start. I like to ask this question of people because we get such smart and eclectic people here. And most of the people are doing work that they never even knew existed when they were a kid. Like, you didn't grow up thinking, I'm going to write books about the future of work.
No, that was not the plan.
So just quickly, I mean, obviously in your bio, it's told you a little bit about how you've gotten here, but tell us a little bit about the journey that leads you to this place and this day.
Sure. So for me personally, I grew up in the Midwest, actually, in Southern Illinois, raised largely by a single mom in Southern Illinois, which was not always easy for her or for us. And so, kind of came from a little bit more hard scrabble of a background. Went to college, full 9 yards, went to work initially for Boston Consulting Group, which was a fantastic sort of learning experience. Learned a ton in terms of analytical horsepower and strategy and all that kind of great stuff. And then I jumped out into .com 1.0, what turned out to be the bubble back in the late 1990s. And I got my behind kicked pretty hard because I knew nothing about management and leadership, it turns out. And what I quickly learned, largely through mistakes, was this old phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, is so true. You can have the world's greatest strategy in the world, but if you can't get a team of talented people aligned behind it, marching with common purpose, it doesn't matter. It's just not going to work. And so I spent the next 2.5, almost 3 decades now going the other direction, which is getting deeper in understanding what drives people. How do you motivate people? How do you get them aligned around these missions and visions that we all want to have? And how do you make that work? A lot of it I learned through mistakes and trial and error. A lot of it I learned through mentorship of other people. And a lot of it I learned by listening to my own team. And that's kind of what's brought me here to where I am today.
An underestimated source of learning, listening to our own team, 100%. Like if you spend all this time hiring smart people, and if what you're doing is impacting them most, like we really ought to pay attention to what they have to say, right?
Absolutely.
So Brian, I mentioned in your bio when I was introducing you something about the Future Forum, and I want to have you talk about that briefly because it relates directly to this book, which is going to be obviously a big part of what we're going to talk about. So what the heck is the Future Forum?
So Future Forum itself is a think tank. It's a research-driven consortium backed by Slack, along with our partners at Boston Consulting Group, Miller Knoll, who's big in the office furnishing space and does a lot around research of understanding what works for people in physical environments, and a group called Management Leadership for Tomorrow. They're a nonprofit focused on advancing especially the careers of Black and Hispanic folks in the U.S. What those groups have come together to do is help enable leaders to sort of rethink and redesign work going forward. The last 2 years have had such a major sea change in terms of just sort of blowing up a lot of parts of conventional wisdom about leadership, about work, about how it all comes together. Not only when and where, but really how. And so we do two things at Future Forum. We do research. Every quarter that goes by, we release another version of our Future Forum Pulse. It's a quarterly survey of over 10,000 knowledge workers around the globe. In fact, for those of your listeners who are listening in live on this show, tomorrow, Tuesday, is the day that it actually comes out for this quarter. The other thing we do is we gather groups of executives. We get people together that are wrestling with, am I going back to 2019 and how things used to work? Or am I taking what I've learned over the past couple of years and moving forward and continuing to evolve? And so Future Forum,
I want to come back to that a little bit more in a second,
Absolutely.
Brian. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So you have a word in the title, other than the word future, which of course is an important word in the title of the book. But you have another word that you and I agree on. I've been saying for a long time that the future of work is flexible. Yeah. And I think, well, and the title of the book says leading flexible teams. So let's talk about that word. What does flexible mean to you in this context?
Yeah, so flexibility is a couple of different concepts underneath it. We usually, when we talk about flexibility, what gets wrapped up in the press all the time is how many days a week somebody can work from home, right? Because the last 2 years have sort of blown up everybody's expectations. By the way, I happen to lead Future of Work at Slack too, which was, it turns out, a very office-centric company. So we went through the same thing as almost every other executive team. And that whole wrestling match that you had historically about, will people really be productive working from home? We've kind of proven that time and time and time again over the past couple of years. There's also lots of evidence around how flexibility in terms of location disproportionately benefits different groups of folks, which we can get into. But the other really core concept underneath flexibility is it's not just where you work, it's when you work. And we have, built up decades and decades of sort of historical norms around the industrial age, which is the 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the office is how and where and when work gets done. The challenge is over the past decade or so, we've actually compounded some of those when problems. 9 to 5 is not only available for work, but it's getting jam-packed full of meetings, right? And so what happens is people really want flexibility, not only in terms of where they work, but they really want to find a way to break with that 9 to 5 norm, because what's happened is all of our days have gotten so full with meetings that your own work gets jammed into the after dinner hours or after the kids are in bed. So when we talk about flexibility, it's not just thinking about a day or two a week from home. It's thinking critically about, how do I allow teams to collaborate more asynchronously as well as time together? How do I give people more time to focus on their own work as well as building belonging with my team?
I love that phrase, building belonging. I want to go back to something that you said that I know. I shouldn't say I know. I'm confident that you've heard many times in these various conversations with the Future Forum. It's the same thing I'm confident that we've heard from our clients and executives around the world as well. And it's about the struggle of what's next, in part given that a lot of these folks had tremendous amount of success themselves in the before times, as one of my team members calls it. So from your perspective, I guess I'd like to talk about that struggle and that tension a bit. And I'd like to start with where are people struggling and I'll say executives, but it doesn't have to be executives. Where are people struggling the most with all of this future of work stuff now?
So there's a material disconnect between executives and their employees around this, right? We see it. You see it in the headlines. You see it in the quotes that come from different executives. In our own research, 79% of people want location flexibility. Vast majority of those people don't want 5 days a week. There's only 20% roughly that want 5 days a week in the office. Of that 79%, though, most people don't want to be fully remote. They just don't want to be 5 days a week, or even often more than 2 days a week. So that kind of rubs up against a lot of executives who have decades and decades of experience with the way that work always was in the past that also made them successful, right? Because I was successful, so therefore this must work. And this shows up in a couple of different places. From a survey perspective, of teams that have been working fully remote, 74% of executives want to come back in the office 3 days a week or more, versus like 24% of their employees want to come back 3 days a week or more. Most people want to come in 1 or 2. And that's creating this rub that you're hearing out there and this tension, right? And a lot of that is because of a couple of factors. One, executives actually have a different lived experience. All of us, like my house is a pretty good setup. It works pretty well. But by the way, when I come into the office, it's much more likely that I have an office where I can close the door and I can be productive and I can be effective, unlike shoving me into an open office floor plan, which doesn't actually help in a lot of different ways. Second, a lot of executives aren't listening to their own employees. 63% of execs in our survey tell us that they're doing their future work planning with little to no direct input from their employees. And that becomes really critical, because what we see also in the data is that especially caregivers, Black employees, Hispanic, Latinx employees, Asian Americans in the US are the ones that want flexibility more than their white colleagues or than the executive group, which, by the way, more often looks like me, a little bit older, a little bit more white, a little more male.
Hey, I'm even whiter than you, so let's. I'm whiter hair for sure.
Yeah, you win on the hair. So there's a little bit of like, are you listening to your own employees and what they're saying? But at the root of it, I think there's also just a lot of, I'm used to working this way, and change is hard. And so a lot of what we do with executives is coach them on, look, this is another transformation. There have been other transformations like this in the past. You wouldn't sit there in the year 2000, you would not have sat there and said, you know what, we're going to ditch this whole email thing and we're going to go back to chaining voicemails together as a way of communicating, right? Sitting here today,
everyone needs a fax machine, Brian. We all
exactly. Let's go back to the telegraph while we're at it. The amount of change we've gone through is a lot, and it's often hard. What we want executives to do instead is say, look, you can actually be frustrated with this, and this can be really challenging, but we want you to come at it with an open mind and say, what's more likely to happen over the next 5 years? Is it likely that going backwards is the thing that's going to drive my future success? Or can I tap into what I've learned over the past couple of years and take a more flexible approach to grab top talent, bring them into my organization, and find a more successful way forward?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And you said something a little bit ago, which I've said to lots of groups of employees, and that is, we have to. I'm not giving a pass to executives, but I think employees can give them some grace, because listen, it's worked for them. They know how to make it work. They want the organization to succeed, and they want to help you be successful like they were. It's just that they're having a hard time getting past that. And I think that, like this isn't a political show. It's not a political conversation, but like in so many parts of our world where things get more divisive, if we can just step back and say, why is it that that's their perspective?
Yeah.
It makes a lot more sense. And then we have a chance to move forward. I think the other interesting thing that you said is, I think you said 63% aren't really involving their employees. And that is a critical problem. What's your advice, Brian, if someone who's listening now is not the executive? Maybe they're a middle manager. And they're not, and they don't feel like, and not necessarily them personally, but that the organization's voice is being heard. What advice might you have for them?
So a couple of things. One is, one of my favorite lines that one of the executives we work with has around this is, help people understand that they are not a focus group of one, that their own experience is not the same. So there's a couple of things that we like to do in those kind of situations. If you're the middle manager that's facing this, one is bring data. Right? a lot of what we're focused on here is outcomes. And this is the place where you can actually get executives and employees aligned. If we're talking about what are the outcomes that we're trying to drive, you create a more level playing field, you create a more productive conversation about it. And it's a way to actually bring both sides together to talk about what are the objectives here. And one of the objectives isn't going to be just like the business outcomes, but employee engagement, right? Because employee satisfaction, reducing turnover, especially given everything that's going on in the job market, is a really critical factor in doing this. So asking that question, what's the outcome that we're after? Because then you can propose different ways of approaching this that aren't just focused on an argument about how many days a week somebody needs to be in.
Yeah, I think that is such good advice because, as leaders, we must be focused on the tension between the outcomes and the others, the people that are doing the work. And if we are helping leaders see the business case or the outcomes, and I love the order that you talked about it, because a lot of people want to start with, we're going to hurt retention, and it starts to feel like, well, it's us versus them. It's some sort of veiled threat. And that's not how you framed it. And that's not how you're suggesting people frame it.
That's right.
And yet, if we'll focus on the business, the other business outcomes first and share the data, what have we been able to do over the 2 years when we've been the way we are, et cetera, et cetera. And I love your question about if we go back to the way we were in the before times, 2019, right, do we have a better chance in 5 years to be in a better spot than if we look at changing something now? I think it's a fabulous way to frame it. I love that.
Sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was just going to say that one of the things, so effectively, everybody, we've talked about the first chapter and a half of the book, but it's an important and critical part of all this. And you and your co-authors framed this around a phrase called, which some of us may have heard, but I think it's useful for us to talk about now, and that's the idea of digital first. What do you mean by that as we start to think about what the future looks like?
So a lot of conversations go around like, how do you think about the orientation? And are you remote first? Everybody's heard that term. Or are you hybrid? The challenge with some of those terms is remote first can sound pretty off-putting. It sounds like remote sounds like distant, you're off someplace else. Hybrid, the term itself typically just focuses on how many days a week somebody needs to be in the office, as opposed to the other part of flexibility, which is time and schedules, which we can also get into. Digital first really means that I'm taking a different approach. Instead of assuming that the office itself is the center and the locus of everything that my organization does, how do I think about all the digital tools and the ways in which people connect as being really the core? The office then becomes a tool, a supplement, a way in which you are providing space for those that need it, that you are bringing people together largely for socialization and relationship building, which is what they're looking for. And it's a way of recentering the conversation. Let's put it this way. If you dialed back 2 years and you said, instead of taking away the access to the office, I took away all the software that people use at work and said, you're going back to being telephone based. How do we think businesses and industries would have fared over the past couple of years? It would have been a disaster. This progression has actually been happening for decades. The advent of broadband access into people's homes, software and tools that are available, global dispersion of your team, all of that has been happening, as well as demographic changes sitting underneath it. And the last 2 years have just been this massive acceleration of changes that were already starting to happen. And so digital first means taking this approach that says, I'm going to think first about how do I stitch these teams together. We always pair it up with the phrase, digital first doesn't mean never in person. It's not to say that you shouldn't bring people together. In fact, that's an essential ingredient in building those relationships and that camaraderie that people need to feel like, they trust one another, they know each other well.
Yeah, I've been saying that all we did was put the future on fast forward, right? We just hit the fast forward button and sped it all up. And we would have gotten to a lot of these places eventually anyway, just a matter of we did it much faster. Yes. So Brian, the book really comes at 7 big steps that we can take, and we don't have time to unpack them all. And we're talking with Brian Elliott, one of the authors of the book, How the Future Works, leading flexible teams to do the best work of their lives, and who doesn't want that? And so we don't have time to unpack it all. You all need to go buy a copy of this book. I highly recommend it. But I do want to talk about a couple of these a little bit. And you and I talked before we went live about how much our thinking is in alignment. And when I had scanned the book before I said, yeah, let's have Brian on, I didn't know exactly how aligned we really are. We use some different language a little bit, but I want to talk about a couple of these ideas here. You talk about the idea of the culture of connection, and we can certainly talk about the culture of connection, but I'd actually like to just start with the word culture. And what is your thought about culture in a digital first, flexible working environment moving forward? Let's talk about that. And then you want to add the word connection to it as well. That'd be great.
Sure. Culture, at the end of the day, is how do you get people aligned around your mission and your vision, and what are the habits and practices that you show as an individual? Usually, one of the ways we measure it within our own survey and research is around sense of belonging. Do I feel a sense of belonging with my team, right? And we all have seen and read books and seen studies that say that people are looking for more purpose-driven work, right? So understanding what that looks like is really important. But it's also really important that I feel like I have a team in which I belong myself. And especially as teams get more diverse, that becomes more challenging often for people in terms of how do you build that. So building that sense of belonging ends up being really critical within teams. There is an aspect to that which is coming together, which is really valuable. My team does it once a quarter. We're actually distributed around North America. We bring people together once a quarter for not just, the next quarter's planning, but importantly for meals together, for a volunteer activity, for some form of more in-depth getting to know each other. But there are so many ways to build that sense of belonging with your team that are week to week and work perfectly well in virtual or distributed settings. I'll give you two really easy examples. One is what we do every single Monday morning in our Monday morning meeting with the team, which is an icebreaker. It's an upfront question that can be anything from, what type of Winter Olympian would you want to be? What's your favorite song, favorite meal that you had in the past couple of weeks? It's just a way of getting people talking and getting them to know one another. I've had people describe that as, I've heard that described in other places as, but that's unproductive use of meeting time. It's hugely valuable, especially as teams grow and change, for people to get to know one another. Another concept is personal operating manuals. You can find this in the book. There's a bunch of tactical stuff, including a set of guidebooks at the end that allow you to do it yourself. A personal operating manual is a description of me, right? It's what are my likes, my dislikes, my foibles, my background, where am I from? 2 pages, super straightforward. But my sharing it as a leader opens up a conversation and makes it easier for other people to do the same. It shows a bit of vulnerability on my part also, because it's a fairly honest assessment of my strengths and weaknesses. And so what you're trying to do with your team is open up that conversation and make it safer for them. Culture at the end of the day only occurs in teams in which they feel this term psychological safety, right? They feel like they can take risks. They feel like they can ask questions. They feel like they can participate fully in the conversation. If you can do that, by the way, fantastic things happen. Last thing that I'll give you is that sense of belonging topic. It's actually the worst in our survey among teams that are fully in person. It's actually better for teams that either have a hybrid or a fully remote setup, because people have found ways in which they're blending these tools together.
And I think that, for 2 years, we've been talking with teams and leaders around the world and asking them, what are your biggest challenges? And from April of 2020 right up until now, almost always the number one is a sense of connection, or sense of being connected. And I think what people have found is they've realized that maybe they took it for granted before. And so now many of them are trying to figure it out. And so even if they'd like more of it, or they're still not used to not being able to do it the way they used to, if you're in an organization where because of your work, you never sent people home, couldn't send people home, where you're delivering services directly, and people are still there. I think this is a lesson for all of those leaders, that we need to make sure that we're still creating and working hard to create that sense of connection, as opposed to assuming it's there just because everyone's down the hall or in the warehouse together or whatever.
That's right. And we actually, in the book itself, one of the reasons why we wrote it is we were talking with so many leaders in different companies in different industries. They were giving us stories about what was working for them. So Royal Bank of Canada in the financial services industry, or Levi Strauss and Company, which has, consumer goods and retail operations, Genentech, a big biotechnology firm, all of these organizations that aren't tech organizations, they're actually spending the time and investing in look, what if we actually took an intentional design process against this? What if we gave managers tips, tricks, habits that actually produce, a deeper sense of belonging with their team? What you end up with is happier, more loyal employees. And at the end of the day, that actually almost always is the number one thing on the CEO's agenda: talent.
One more of the 7 before we start to wrap up, and that is experimentation. So talk to me about what you mean there. And I think that as we move forward, there's still lots of room to do this. We're still figuring this out all together, right? So talk to us about experimentation.
Experimentation is really kind of essential in this, because let's put it this way: anybody who says they've got it all figured out, the title of our book is a little audacious, How the Future Works, right? But the aspects that we really want people to think about is this experimentation, iteration, trial and error that we all need to see what's working and what's not. In fact, one of the big pieces of advice we give to leaders is come at it with an attitude of, I don't have all the answers, and I want to enlist you in finding them and discovering them. And experimentation and iteration can either be intentionally designed, or much more often in organizations that are beyond a couple hundred people, there's somebody in your organization that's already trying some of what's in the book. There's somebody out there that's already doing some level of, they've got a team level agreement that they've been iterating on about how they work together, right? Or they are using personal operating manuals, or finding other ways in which they're testing this out. This is how we actually did it within Slack. You'd think that, we could, as a tech company, design all this stuff up front. We actually gathered a group of people that were representatives both around the globe, different demographics and different teams, and found there were 3 or 4 of those groups that actually had some really cool stuff they'd been trying already. We took those, got other people adopting those and adapting them for their own purpose. I'll give you a really simple example. Concept called Maker Weeks. Maker Week is 1 week a quarter. You cancel all of your recurring meetings. It's a way to get a break, but also to think about, do I need all those meetings? Do they need 20 people in them? Do they have a good agenda? Like, let's put some hygiene around this. That started off in our product and engineering team. We then expanded it out to the rest of the Slack organization by actually saying, how does that translate? What's that look like for the sales team, who has very different habits and practices? It's now being used by 65% of Salesforce, a 75,000 person organization. So those types of small team experiments that someone's been running that prove successful, that you then adapt to a different team, a different environment, is one of the best ways to make progress, as opposed to the top-down mandate, everybody's going to fix their meeting calendars, which we all know doesn't really work.
Doesn't work. That I wrote this morning, Brian, or it was published this morning, that I make the point that policies need expiration dates, and it gets this at this very same idea that we got to try, and then we got to tweak, and then we got to try. And I love this idea of listening to our organization, listening to our teams, finding out what's working, and applying and tweaking that. So I love that. So,
and by the way, Kevin, if you're one of those leaders that's leading one of those teams that has those ideas, please share them with the rest of your organization. Find ways to share that out with other people. People will grab it, they'll use it, and eventually, hopefully, your organization will also turn you into the champions of change they want to see.
Beautiful, 100%. So, what didn't I ask you that you wish I would have? Right.
So one of the biggest things that we found in the data early on that surprised me and surprised a lot of people is the benefits that flexibility gives to historically underrepresented groups. So we saw this at the beginning of the pandemic. Sense of belonging, as we all went from working in offices to working in homes, fell on average, right? And that's not surprising when you think about it. We were all very used to, a particular way of working. When we dug into the data, though, it actually fell for white office workers by a fair amount. It actually rose for Black and Hispanic office workers in the U.S. We dug into that to get a better understanding of it. There's a professor at Stanford, Brian Lowry, who was the first one in one of our academic settings to say it's code switching. Even for him, as a Black professor on Stanford's campus, the cost of 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the office is just emotionally taxing. The ability to pull back from that, even a day or two a week, even to pull in and pull out on meetings, was a way to recharge his batteries. And every quarter since then, what we've seen consistently is the desire for flexibility is stronger among Black, Hispanic, Asian American office workers than it is for their white colleagues. So as an executive designing this and thinking about it, you've got to keep that in mind. It's also very true for caregivers. And in the US, that's women with children more than men with children. Same in the UK, a little bit more balanced in continental Europe. But if you are someone who is, again, older, white, and male executive like me, knowing and understanding that your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and your future work plans are tied together is really essential.
I love that. So I'm going to shift gears before we finish, Brian, and ask you a couple of questions that I always ask, only one of which you know, unless you've watched or listened to other podcasts. And one of them is this. So, Brian, what do you do for fun?
Oh, my God. I cook a fair amount these days with the family, with the kids, and just have fun doing that type of stuff. Feeding others is one of my ways of getting joy in life. And I'm also a runner for exercise. Put the headphones on, crank up some tunes, get out there, and just that's my relaxation and recharge.
We will not ask you for your playlist, but I am going to ask you for your reading list. So Brian, when we first met, which was about 7 minutes before we went live here with all the rest of you, I got to see, many of you are only listening. You don't get to see what's behind Brian, which is books. And the first thing that I did was say, how many of the ones I can see part of have I read? And I can count at least 6 of what I can recognize from the sides of you, as well as, of course, this book, How the Future Works, that I've read. So the question I ask everyone, I'm going to ask you as well. I've always asked smart people this. What are you reading these days?
So Tomorrow's Capitalist by Alan Murray. I've got it I think I'm about a third of the way into it. It's a great, Alan knows and talks with a ton of CEOs. And if you're looking to get yourself into the mindset of CEOs who are grappling with the broader sort of outside of profit, what's the mandate? How do you think about stakeholder capitalism? It's a really good read. I've also got Neil Stephenson's latest. If you remember Neil, he did Cryptonomicon and Snow Crash and a bunch of other stuff. It's called Terminal Shock. It's a little depressing because it's about climate change, but hopefully it'll progress a little bit better than that.
So it's interesting that you thank you for that, Brian. For those of you that are here live, tomorrow I'm doing a live with Melanie Bell, and we're going to talk about leaders and fiction and how we can learn to be better leaders through fiction. So there you go.
Fantastic.
And for those of you listening to this on the podcast, it'll be there too later. Be looking forward to that. Leaders who fiction. So the question, Brian, you've been wanting me to ask from the beginning is where can we learn more? Where can we get connected to the book, get connected to you? Where can we learn more? Where do you want to point people?
So futureforum.com is a super easy spot to get to. If you go to futureforum.com, you will find links to the book itself, to our research. On the 19th of July, you'll actually find the next round of research. The book itself is available globally on Amazon, in your local .com, in a lot of bookstores. So check it out. And then you can always follow me right here on LinkedIn as well if you're on LinkedIn.
All right. We hope that you will do that. Brian, we're not quite done, but I want to thank you again for joining us and for sharing some of your wisdom, as well as some of the research that you and Sheila and Helen have put together in creating this really, really great and useful and important book. But before we go, I have a question for all of you who are watching live or listening later. The question is, now what? What are you going to do with this? What's the point? There is no point. Unless you take action. And maybe it's something around culture. Maybe it's something around experimentation. Maybe it's something around the idea of digital first. Maybe it's just this idea of flexibility, or maybe it's what do I need to do as a leader in the middle to help the rest of the organization see what we're seeing. Or maybe it's what I need to do as an executive now to get more people involved in where we're headed in the future, and asking the question, what do you think? So whatever it is, if you don't take some action from this, sort of what was the point? I mean, Brian and I, we're smart and good looking, but there's better things that you could spend your time with, unless you want to get or make a real difference in your organization. And I know that's why you were here, and I know that that's why Brian wrote this book. And so, Brian, thanks again so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. Really, I've been looking forward to this, and I'm glad we had the chance to do it.
Kevin, thank you very much. And to all your listeners, be the change you want to see in the world. Make it happen.
I love that. And listen, everybody, if you enjoyed this, you can come back again, because we're here every week, almost every week live, and every week on the podcast. So I hope you'll join us again for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.